I mean, I could imagine, though, a skeptic coming back and saying, well, if the conveners of the conference were saying they didn't feel many solutions were on the table, certainly intelligent design isn't the one they should be reaching for, because that is a non-solution. It's a typical objection that essentially it's got other gaps. It's just inserting a supernatural entity when we should be looking for further science to explain these things. I mean, what's your response to that kind of objection?
Well, I think it all begs the question as to the definition of science, and this has been why people have been unwilling to reach for anything beyond. Science has been defined in recent years by reference to a principle that has a fancy name from the philosophy of sciences called the principle of methodological naturalism. If you're going to be a scientist, you must limit yourself to strictly naturalistic or materialistic explanations of everything, irrespective of what the evidence may or may not show. And this is a principle that is of relatively recent vintage in the history of science. It goes back to the late 19th century. It was implicit in Darwin's argument in The Origin of Species. But if you go back even a bit further, if you go back to the period of the scientific revolution, you have people making design arguments as part of their scientific works. I was just talking to a very fine Newton scholar just the other day, Steve Snowbelin, who did his PhD in Cambridge and the history and philosophy of science. And he's going to be giving a talk about how the role of natural theology in the most important work of science ever written, that is in the Principia, and then later in Newton's epilogue to the Principia, the General Scholium. So the idea that scientists must limit themselves to explanations that do not, in any case, invoke creative intelligence is something of recent vintage in the history of science. And in any case, it's intellectually limiting. Imagine if you go into the famed Assyrian room, or you go into the British Museum and you see the Rosetta Stone, and you look at that and you say, well, what caused these interesting etchings? If you're committed to methodological naturalism, you're going to have to say, well, it must have been something like wind and erosion or chemical etchings or something purely naturalistic. But of course, that's not the best explanation, because that stone is encarved with information in 3 separate languages. And we know from our uniform and repeated experience, which is the actual basis of scientific reasoning, that information always arises from an intelligent source. So what we've been arguing is that we want to let the evidence determine whether invoking a designing agent or invoking purely natural causes provides the best explanation for a given phenomena, and not allow a meta-level methodological principle that has been advanced in a normative way to dictate the outcome of the investigation. In other words, we should be open to the best explanation, not simply the best naturalistic explanation, if in fact the evidence points to something beyond what we know matter and energy can do, and instead points to something that we know uniquely intelligent agents can do.